Last Sunday, I did something that I don't think I've ever done before, maybe never will do again, but I was talking about this series of Nehemiah that we're going through, and I realized it was going to be Stewardship Sunday this Sunday, and I said, maybe I can find a passage out of the book of Nehemiah to use as a text for Stewardship Sunday, and therefore put myself on the spot a little bit. I didn't know if I would find something. It should not surprise us in a book that's devoted to this collective effort on the part of God's people to work together on a project to bring glory and honor to God, that we would find some information on stewardship. As a matter of fact, there were 2 or 3 different passages we could have used. It makes great material. And if you read through the whole book of Nehemiah, you will find that their spirit and attitude towards giving was part and parcel of their dedication to rebuild the wall around the city of Jerusalem. So I've chosen this passage in Nehemiah chapter 10 to talk about the blessing of sacrifice. And so before I go into some practical points about stewardship, and we're going to have to move along kind of quickly with the Lord's Supper coming up in just in a few brief moments, I thought I'd give you a little bit of background about what's happening here. First of all, you will find out how surprising it may be that the people had such a deep and committed willingness to sacrifice on a personal level, far more than I have ever done in my life. Secondly, you may notice also that Pastor Joel's Sunday school lesson out of 2 Corinthians chapter 8 fits in so closely with this. We did not compare notes or intend to do this, but he was going to bring a message on stewardship, and the theme of his Sunday school lesson fits so closely with this one. But let me give you a little bit of background here, what's going on. This great work that Nehemiah had rallied the people toward in rebuilding this wall was progressing along. They had some opposition. We covered that last week. We'll look at some other things also next week. But right in the middle of this great effort where they were sacrificing, seeing the work completed, the wall was joined together and it was halfway up. Opposition was coming, and it was then, of all times, that God spoke to the hearts of the people about this matter of stewardship or giving, not so much towards the construction of the wall, interestingly, but rather the sanctuary, the temple that was there. You have to understand, these are just normal people like us, okay? Many of the people were engaged in occupations like farming, or they were working in the trades. And if you don't put it in perspective, you forget how everything changed in their lives during this temporary period of time, this about 7-year period where they built the wall around the city. This is not a TV show where, practical things are just forgotten and glossed over and everything turns out good at the end. These are real people living in real life with struggles and problems like anybody else. And while they were engaged in building this wall, they could no longer work their farms. Or if they were in the trades, they could no longer open their shops or engage in business or whatever it was that brought income into their family life. All of those things were temporarily suspended as they were constructing the wall. And you really have to appreciate their dedication to the work of God. And to make matters worse, this chapter and the ones following touch on some other things that are probably familiar to most of us that we deal with on a regular basis. Not the least of which is the government there in that area, the Persian government was in control. They were requiring tribute. Tribute is another nice word for what? Taxes. So the government still expected the people to pay their taxes. Furthermore, a lot of the farmers in particular were leasing land. They didn't own the land themselves. They paid to lease it, and then they would pay a certain amount of their money to the people who owned the properties as their crops would come in. But guess what? They weren't farming their crops. They were building a wall around the city of Jerusalem. Some of them had debts. And guess what? We'll put it in this terminology. When you owe money on a credit card, and you say, I've been busy lately. I don't think I want to make my payment this month. That usually doesn't go over good with your creditors. They still had to pay off their debts with interest. All of these financial pressures are coming upon the people who have devoted themselves to the construction of this wall. The government still wanted their taxes. The property owners still wanted their rent monies, and the debtors still required their payments with interest. In the midst of all of this financial hardship, this is the amazing thing, we find that they made a decision in verse 32, a very formal decision. They made an ordinance, a requirement, a law, that they would give up a certain part of their money, a third part of a shekel, to be used specifically for the service of the house of the Lord. By the way, a house that had been neglected too. They saw a tremendous need. Maybe as they saw the progression on the wall, they said, "Oh, this is great, but look at the sanctuary. It's in shambles, and it had been neglected." God would use a different man other than Nehemiah to work on that project, a man by the name of Ezra, who spearheaded an effort to get the sanctuary rebuilt and redone. But that's another book, and that's another story. But the workers, noticed that, hey, they were gaining pride in their workmanship. They were saying, hey, we're seeing a measure of protection about our city, where we're having our dignity restored, our way of life is going back to normal, and therefore our worship will return to normal. But look at the house of the Lord, it's been neglected. So let's all give a certain amount of money to help in the work of the house of the Lord. This while all the other financial pressures were being exerted upon these people. Wow, tremendous sacrifice. And then we find no less than 11 references in just verses 35 through 39 to one of these three words, either first fruits, offerings, or tithes. That's not the part of the shekel they were going to give to the extra maintenance of the sanctuary. These people said, hey, we need to go back to a biblical principle of giving of our first fruits, of our tithes, of our offerings to the Lord. And it's a carryover, really, of the laws of stewardship that had been put into place way back in the days of Abraham, back in the book of Genesis. And he's dealing here with the concept of stewardship. Do you know Jesus spoke more in stewardship than he did on heaven and hell combined? Now, Jesus thought that teaching on heaven and hell was important, obviously. But Jesus said more about stewardship than he did on heaven and hell combined. God's people have been giving to God's work and involved in stewardship since the book of Genesis was written. But I don't know if there's ever a people who gave more or sacrificed more in their giving than that generation that Nehemiah lived with. You know, you mentioned in your Sunday school lesson about giving out of their poverty. These people were volunteering. They were not being paid to build the wall. They were volunteering their time. They were putting aside their own businesses and their farming and whatever trades they have to do the work around the house of the Lord. They were paying their taxes, paying the leases, paying off their debts. Oh, by the way, let's raise some extra money for God's work because the sanctuary has been neglected. It's in shambles. And they were really, really stretching themselves in their giving. And that's why I want to preach a message entitled, The Blessing of Sacrifice. Because sometimes our giving involves a heavy sacrifice in our parts. Let me give you a definition. Sacrifice is a willingness and sometimes even an eagerness to give up something valuable for something or someone we deem more valuable. I don't think I have that in my notes, but let me say it again since I don't. Sacrifice is a willingness and sometimes even an eagerness to give up something valuable for something or someone we deem more valuable. Let me give an example of that. For those men in our congregation who are married, your wives probably have a ring around their finger as a token of that marriage bond that you made years ago, sometimes many years ago. I remember when I wanted to get engaged to my wife, I was very poor, extremely poor. I was just out of college. I was not making any money. I had no savings. I was driving a clunker of a car. But I wanted to impress my wife with my ability to provide for her security for the rest of our lives. So I had to muster up some money to buy a wedding set and have that all prepared before I asked her to marry me. Now, I don't know if my wife even knows this, but I'm going to tell you. I want to give you an idea of how poor I was. I don't know where you went to go shopping for your wedding bands and your engagement rings. I was told you're supposed to get a diamond. For that. I was looking at a cubic zirconia, to be honest with you. In fact, some years after we were married, we were not doing much better financially, and my wife's ring had these prongs at the top, and we lost the diamond out of it, and I temporarily had to replace it with a cubic zirconia. Nobody ever knew because they look kind of the same, but cubic zirconia is a fancy term for glass. It's just basically glass, and you put it in there. It looks like a diamond and so forth. But I didn't have money to put another. When she lost a diamond, I was like, and it wasn't a big one. It was a relatively small diamond. But when I went to go shopping, I had nobody to guide and direct me, by the way, in this process. No parents or friends or whatever. Here's where I went to buy the wedding set for my wedding. I went to Best Buy. Remember the Best? They used to have a Best Buy. Is it not even around anymore? It's still there. They used to sell wedding sets really cheap. And I paid, I'll tell how deep I went in my pockets. I paid for my diamond, small diamond wedding ring in my band. I paid $350, which was a huge amount of money for me at the time. Nowadays, young people, I'm just saying, it's not like that anymore. You can't get that band for $350 and that diamond wedding ring. But I thought I was making such a generous sacrifice to my wife, because a sacrifice is a willingness and sometimes even an eagerness to give up something valuable for something or someone we deem more valuable. I like how one person put it. If it doesn't cost, it doesn't count. Not really a sacrifice unless it costs you something. These people here in Nehemiah's day were paying dearly to be able to work on the wall and give above that to God's work. And their sacrifices involved far more than just their financial resources. It spilled over into every area of their life. They were giving up their time and their talents and sometimes their possessions, their goals, and certainly their free life was put on suspended animation as they were working on the wall. That's why a failure to understand proper attitudes towards stewardship can really produce problems in our other lives. And the writers of the New Testament in particular warned about that. If we don't have this thing right with our attitudes towards money, it's going to spill over into other areas of our lives. John wrote about it. Paul wrote extensively on the importance of being careful about your attitude towards money. Jesus, as I said, spoke on it often. Let me just give you one sampling written by Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 6. He said, "For we brought nothing into this world." True or false? We brought nothing into this world. We didn't come out, the day of our birth with a financial package, portfolio. We came with nothing. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. True or false? Not taking it with us, folks. He had it right. "And having food and raiment, let us be there with content. But they that will be rich fall into a temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition." The Bible never says that money is the root of all evil, but rather the love of money is the root of our evil. We don't have our attitudes right towards money, it's going to produce other problems in our lives. When it occupies a position of prominence in our hearts, money can become a curse rather than a blessing. So the only way to keep money from capturing our hearts is to understand and practice biblical stewardship, God's mind and instruction regarding money. Meaning we become conduits rather than just consumers of buying things. We are motivated by grace and not by greed. And we perceive ourselves as stewards rather than owners of the money that God puts in our possession. And when we learn that secret and understand it and embrace it and put it in practice in our lives, we are truly blessed indeed. The blessing of sacrifice. Now, let me give you some principles, and I'm going to go so quickly on this, I promise you this. Some of you are going to have a hard time writing all of these points down before I'm jumping to the next point. So if you're going to take notes, and I would encourage you to do so, let me give you 6 principles real quickly, and then we'll wrap this up, okay? And I hope you do take notes on this. It'll be beneficial. Number 1, and we'll put these on the monitor for you. Sacrificial giving develops and demonstrates devotion to God. Proverbs 3:9 says, "Honor the Lord with thy substance," and this is an interesting word, first fruits, the one that appears several times in Nehemiah in this chapter, "and the first fruits of all thine increase." And then the next verse in Proverbs 3 tells us why. It says, "So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. We honor the Lord when we give sacrificially. And therefore, a failure to give God our first fruits, the first part of what he provides for us, really will bring dishonor to the Lord by argument. And in fact, Malachi puts it more sternly. He says, a man that does not engage in tithing will be robbing, in effect, robbing God. Can you imagine if we passed the offering plates next week, and as they were making their way around the auditorium, someone said, ooh, somebody put a $50 bill in there. I could really use that $50. And they kind of went and took it and stuck it in their pocket and passed the plate on. Can you imagine? I hope I'm not giving anybody any ideas, by the way. I'm just using this as an illustration. Can you imagine somebody having the audacity to take the money that's been given to God's work and just sort of stick it in their pocket? Unthinkable. We would never dream of doing that. We would say, no, I couldn't. That money belongs to God. And it, in fact, does belong to God. Our first fruits means that before we itemize our bills and put gas in the car and buy our food and make our payments for housing, before we do that, we honor God first, the first fruits. Suppose, Brad, suppose I said to you and Vanessa and your family, I said, hey, my wife and I want to have you guys over for dinner next week. So we'll go after church on Sunday. We went to church. They came over to our house, and, you know, Mike is a teenager. Teenagers are always hungry. He's thinking to himself, I wonder what Mrs. Miller's going to serve. I hope it's something I like. Teenagers think like that. I wonder if it's something that I like. And they get there. We arrive at my house at the same time, and we get out. We make our way into the house, and he's ready to smell that meal. And nobody smells anything cooking inside the house. Well, I guess she's going to whip something up real quick. And I said, hey, come on in. Good to see everybody here. Here's the deal. I noticed this past week that I have several leftovers here that are getting near the time where, you know, we got to make a decision on them. You know, they're not going to be around much longer. And so I just thought I'd kill two birds with one stone. I'd get some fellowship with Brad and his family and have them over. And so here's what I'm going to do. And I take all these containers out of the refrigerator, several of them, put them on the counter and say, here's what we need. Just pick something that you think you'd like. We'll throw it in the microwave. Bam. We're good to go for lunch. Brad would look at me like, are you absolutely out of your mind, Pastor? What can you be thinking? And when you open up some of the containers and see they're already past the time that you should. Now, we may eat leftovers ourselves, but if I invite someone over and you invite someone over, you should probably make a fresh meal with, yeah, thank you, Brett. That's healthy and looks delicious. And, you know, I want to put out my very best for my guests. God wants us to put out our very best for him. Amen. Our first fruits. The best of what we've got. And take care of our obligations to God before we take care of any other obligations in our life. It's a demonstration of our devotion to God. And God deserves our best. Secondly, sacrificial giving leads our hearts to eternal concerns. There are many Bible verses, and in our practical sense, we know what happens to the many things that we spend money on, whatever it may be. Eventually, given enough time, what we buy and invest money in depreciates or corrodes or breaks or is consumed. It's gone. A lot of stuff we spend money on, it's gone. That's just the nature of life. We can't take it with us anyway. And Matthew's gospel specifically warns us about laying up treasures on earth where the moths corrupt it, or it's stolen or destroyed, or gets worn out. And so the principle is that we need to think in terms of eternity. What I do and what you do with our finances should be done with a thought that how can this hold the greatest eternal reward from my life? It is true that our hearts will determine what we treasure. It's also true that our treasures will draw away our heart. Whatever we treasure will draw away our hearts. And so we need to make sure that we invest in things with eternal concerns. Number 3, quickly, sacrificial giving allows us to fully serve God. Remember that story of the rich young ruler? You can say what you want about him. I admire him. He seemed sincere. He lived a very moral life. He walked the line. He had a good reputation within the community, had a good business mindset. He wanted to serve God. He saw other people following Jesus, and he says, I want to follow Jesus too. He went through the effort to seek him out and find him and said, I want to be one of your disciples. And Jesus said, well, you're going to have to make a decision. What is it? Well, it's either serving me or your money. What do you want? Your choice. And you know how that one ended. The Bible says he walked away sorrowful. I believe he had every intention of being a disciple of Jesus Christ, but his heart was attached to his material possessions. And we need to be careful about that. Sacrificial giving allows us to fully serve God. John Wesley said this. He was concerned, and he lived during a time when there wasn't a lot of money floating around, but he was living during a time where money kind of came and went, and he was particularly sensitive to allowing financial things to sway his heart away. And he made this statement one day. When I have money, I get rid of it as quickly as possible, lest it find a way into my heart. Wow. That's amazing. If some reason I get money, I'm quickly saying, how can I get rid of this? Because I don't want it to find its way into my heart and affect my love and devotion to God. Number 4, sacrificial giving brings rewards in this life and the life that is to come. If all I did when I gave, when any of us give, is to put a smile on the face of our Heavenly Father and demonstrate our loyalty and devotion to Him, that would be enough. If we just gave in just to say, I just want to please my Savior and show Him that I'm on board, I want to serve Him, that would be a good motivation for us to give. But God doesn't leave it at that. He says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to meet your needs because you've been faithful enough and you've had faith to trust me with your finances. And not only am I going to meet your present needs and needs in this life, I'm going to lay up for you eternal rewards in heaven. Now, that ought not be our primary reason for giving, but that's a good one for us to give. We're laying up treasure in heaven. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, if you've given up anything for Him, He's going to reward us 100-fold in the life to come. That's Mark chapter 10, 28 to 30. He's going to reward us for that in heaven. And God will open up the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing. So it brings rewards in the life to come. Number 5, sacrificial giving develops unity among God's people. And that's what happened during Nehemiah's day. They were poor, they were forsaking their jobs, and they didn't have their income. But they said, let's all do a little part, a third part of a shekel, and we'll use that collectively to work on the house of God while we're building the wall here. In the course of our business meeting, and we got a new crew of deacons in, Pastor Joel and I have met, and people from the congregation have discussed things with our staff and with our leadership of our church, speaking of our deacons, about some things that we could do around the property. And one of the things that's a great idea, wasn't my idea, but a great idea to pursue would be to redo the windows in our auditorium for a lot of different reasons. In the mornings, the sunlight from this way, and in the evenings, the sunlight from this way can create glare. So you can see we have shades in our auditorium to prevent the glare. But people said, well, we should open up and have more light. Everybody has a different idea about that, I guess. We should need more light in the auditorium, you know. Some people even say this, we should open the windows up and allow the air into the auditorium, or let the people hear our singing, or whatever the case may be. I do like the fact when we had services outside during that short period with COVID, we just got to sing to the whole community when we did our singing, and I thought that was wonderful. Everybody has a different idea, but I can tell you this much. These windows, this auditorium was built in 1950, and these are the original window frames from 1950, and some of the glass plates do not even fit the frames of the windows. We don't say a lot about it, but they're not really energy efficient by any means. So there's a lot of reasons. That's a good project. One of the things it would do, it would help in creating the intrinsic value of the property, to have energy efficient windows, dual pane windows. We could get tinted windows. We wouldn't have to have the blinds here anymore, and it would let some light in here. And anyway, we started to, Pastor, after the deacons meeting earlier in the year, Pastor Joel and I started working on that project, and we've had vendors come in to give us some quotes on some windows. That would be a good thing for us to do. I think it would make the auditorium look nicer, and it would save us money, a lot of money on energy costs. Because these new windows, these dual pane windows, are seal tight, and they're great on energy efficiency. So that's a project that we could all get involved in. Now, if I said, I need a volunteer who will pay, what the quotes came in at? Yeah, $13,000. I need someone to volunteer to pay for that $13,000 to get the windows done. You were like, Pastor, are you kidding me? That's a lot of money. And it would be. But if we all did a little bit, in fact, you've never heard me say this before. I'm gonna make a statement here. It's not even in my notes, okay? If we would all determine in our congregation, if we would all determine just to be faithful in our tithing, and I'm going to ask that nobody do anything above that, I'm convinced we would raise the money to do the windows and perhaps some other projects as the year went on within a matter of weeks. If all of us would just tithe. In fact, I'm going to make that statement. You can quote me on this. Pastor Miller asked that we not give a dime more for the special project of doing our windows around our auditorium, that all he wants us to do is that everybody in the church collectively tithes. And let's just throw those windows in there. Amen? Just get them in there. Just everybody just tithe. Everybody doing a little bit. Everybody doing their part. That's the whole point of the book of Nehemiah. No, not even an extra fundraising. We've done that in the past for a lot of things, including our facilities. We've raised money for roofs. We've raised money for buildings. We've raised money for parking lots. We don't have to do that. Let's just get a letter out, Pastor. Remind me to get a letter out. And let's just have everybody just tithe. Just pay your tithe, and we'll utilize that money to take care of this project. That's the spirit that was evidenced during Nehemiah's day. Everybody doing their part and recognizing that we all need each other to do a little bit for the needs to be met in God's house. Then finally, sacrificial giving reflects the nature of our Heavenly Father, because all that God does to us is just give. He just gives and gives and gives. He gave us transportation here today. He gave us the clothes that we wear, the roof over our heads, the food that we eat. In fact, he not only just gives to supply our needs, and I'm thankful he does, he gives abundantly. He blesses us in ways that we do not deserve. But the best thing that God ever gave to me was his son. Amen. And I can never repay him for that great gift that he's given to me. I think many times when people are challenged to tithe and give their first fruits to God, it's a real step of faith. I began tithing as a college kid, and I had college bills. I had a car. I had to pay insurance on my car and gas for my car. I had a part-time job. By today's standards, I was poor, and I started going to a church where the pastor encouraged us to be involved in stewardship. And I excused myself by saying, well, I don't even have a real job yet. I'm just in college, and I'm poor. When I wanted to get involved in working in the church, in the bus ministry, the bus director said to get involved in the bus ministry, you need to wear a tie to go out calling on your bus route representing the church. And I'd never wore a tie in my life. So I went to the store and looked at ties, and they were like $8 or $10 back in that day. And $8 or $10 was a lot of money to me. I said, I can't pay $8 or $10 for a tie. And I don't think I can wear the same tie all the time. I got to have more than one. So I literally went to a thrift store and bought ties for 25 cents each. I thought they were such a great deal. I bought 3 or 4 of them. And when I went to church, people looked at me and said, those look like thrift store ties. I don't know so much, not so much the design or the print, but the width of the tie will often dictate what era it came from, and then they're like, why? They're going to keep going like this. Just keep watching the tie. They get wider, and then they get narrow, and they're wider, and narrow, And I was wearing ties that did not fit my generation. And my other friends, peers, were quick to notice that and say something about that. They literally laughed at me and I said, hey, I got it for a quarter. What do you think? And I wore my ties for 25 cents. That's what I did. And the pastor said, you need to be engaged in stewardship, paying your tithe. And I said, I don't, surely doesn't mean me. I'm the guy who's 25-cent tithes. I had to scrape sometimes, literally scrape my change together to put gas in my car. I was very, very poor. And I said, okay, God, this is probably not going to work, but the pastor says to prove God therewith. And so I said, I'm going to start tithing. And I tithed that first week. I was expecting to run out of money and say, see, God, I told you this was going to happen already. But God got me through that week. Not only that, he got me through the next week. And then he got me through the next week. And here I am, all these years later, and God has never failed to get me through the week. You're going to find if you're not engaged in stewardship, I'm excited for you. If you're not engaged in stewardship, I want you to prove God and be faithful in your stewardship. Not only because it's obedient, but you're going to find God provide for you in ways you never thought. You're going to find, first of all, that you're able to do far more with the money that you have left over than you could ever do before. And that you're going to watch God sometimes miraculously, as in my case, miraculously supply for my needs, and it's going to draw you closer to God, and you're going to say, wow, God is engaged in my life. He has provided for me in ways I couldn't imagine. And then this is the kicker. You're going to say, if God can trust me in my finances, maybe I can trust God in other areas of my life as well. And you're going to grow and benefit and find the blessing of sacrifice. Well, I hope and pray that if you're not engaged in giving faithfully to the church, that you allow this message to stir your heart. You look at what happened during Nehemiah's day. If anybody could have used an excuse to say, I can't give to the house of God, it was people during Nehemiah's day, because they were in abject poverty. And they were tirelessly working to the bone to get this wall built. And they left their farms and their businesses. And all the bills were still coming in. And in the middle of that, they said, let's make an ordinance for us to charge ourselves yearly for the third part of the shekel for the service of the house of our God. I don't think God has ever required me to make such a sacrifice financially for him. But if they could do that in their climate, we can certainly do it in ours.